trying to get independence for the Philippines against the Spanish colonizers. Spain had been in control for hundreds of years by that point. And so at the conclusion of the war against Spain, Aguinaldo had hoped that the Philippines would become independent. But the U.S. decides instead to annex it, to colonize it, make it part of the United States. And so that's what happens in 1899. Aguinaldo will then turn on the United States, and he's going to engage in a variety of guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run tactics, sneak attacks, booby traps, all these kinds of things. There's also tales of mutilating, desecrating the bodies of fallen Americans in battle and so forth. And this is going to compel American audiences to view Aguinaldo and these other Filipino rebels as savages. In turn, what the United States is going to do is begin this full-fledged campaign to defeat the Filipino rebels. The U.S. will also be involved in these kinds of shady tactics against Aguinaldo. This will include things like the so-called water cure, which essentially was this form of torture that, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of this before, but basically what you do is you prop open somebody's mouth, you just fill gallons and gallons of water in there to instill the sensation of drowning or suffocation. And if you really don't like that person, you stomp on their stomach, get all the contents out, and then do it all over again. So that's the kind of stuff that was going on here. But it's this tale here of savagery that Aguinaldo and his men were often depicted as. And this will compel the United States to pursue these rebels in a very particular kind of way. Next chapter is about Pancho Villa in Mexico. He also had been briefly an American ally during the Mexican Revolution. And in fact, there were some Americans who had such high hopes for Mexico that they thought, oh, this guy could be basically the George Washington of Mexico. We have really high hopes for him. But the United States will kind of pull away from him in 1915, support one of his key rivals for a variety of reasons. And this will compel Villa and his men, there are about 400 men of his militia, to go and attack the U.S.-Mexico border town of Columbus, New Mexico. And this is an attack that will kill 18 Americans, and it's the worst attack by a private foreign party on the United States until 9/11. So the U.S. is going to then pursue him across the northern Mexican desert for the next 10 months. And there's a lot of intense rhetoric about Pancho Villa. So he's described as a bandit, an outlaw, a savage, but also animalistically. He's described as a wolf, he's described as a rattlesnake, he's described as an insect, this kind of dehumanizing language that completely ignores any kind of justification or reasoning he might have had to want to attack the United States. Next chapter I have is on Augusto Sandino in Nicaragua. And Sandino, he was notable because he was actively and violently resisting the American presence in Nicaragua in the late 1920s and the early 1930s. There were U.S. Marines in the country as peacemakers. Nicaragua had been in the midst of civil war. And all the Nicaraguan combatants come to this agreement, allowed the United States to come in as peacemakers, but there was one guy who held out, and that was Sandino. Sandino believed that the presence of American Marines was a violation of Nicaraguan sovereignty, and so he wanted to make sure that the Marines were expelled. He was operating from the mountainous countryside in northern Nicaragua. He did not have a very big militia, but the U.S. and its local allies simply could not capture him. And there's one press conference that President Herbert Hoover gives in 1931, and it struck me as reading it. He tells the press, he's like, I have no statement for quotation today. And then he keeps on talking to the point where he frustratingly blurts out, Sandino's nothing but a plain bandit. And it was reflective of how a lot of Americans at the time saw Sandino, in large part because of, and this is very similar to what took place in the Philippines decades earlier, the way in which these rebels were fighting against the United States. There were hit-and-run tactics, booby traps, atrocities, and mutilation and desecration of American bodies. And this is also going to compel the United States to use a great deal of force to ignore these new standards of international law about ways in which to treat prisoners. And so this is going to enable the United States to expand and go after the Sandinistas, as they were called, in very violent ways. Chapter 4 talks about Ernesto Che Guevara. He was one of the most famous men in the world, and then he disappears from public view in 1965. Che had been a member of the Cuban Revolutionary government, a native of Argentina, but he had fought with Fidel Castro. And Che will then resign his positions, so that's why he's a non-state actor. That's why I think he qualifies for this. But he gives up his government positions, and he looks to start revolutions elsewhere around the world, anti-capitalist revolutions more specifically. And the thing about Che is that he was seen as very dangerous because he was considered to be attractive. He was kind of a sex symbol in his day. He was seen to be very articulate, very intelligent. He had gone through medical school. And in this Cold War era of the 1960s, the United States wants to make sure that anybody who is espousing socialism does not come across all that attractive. And so Guevara is then denigrated as a guerrilla. And this is a term that he actually saw as a badge of honor. He actually wrote a book called Guerrilla Warfare. But he's denigrated in this way to kind of suggest he doesn't really believe in his causes, that he's really just out for his own personal glory, that he didn't really have any principles. But I think he was a very principled individual, certainly whether you agreed with him or not. And so what happens is the United States will undertake a covert campaign to help authorities in Bolivia try to find and hunt Che Guevara. I move into the 1980s, in the early 90s with Pablo Escobar in Colombia. And Escobar, a name hopefully some of you are familiar with, was one of the wealthiest men in the world in the 1980s. And that was from being the head of the Medellin drug cartel. He was responsible for this grievous violence in Colombia in the 1980s. He had this policy of plato o plomo, silver or lead, meaning if you didn't take his bribes, he would kill you. And so there's a great deal of violence in Colombia in the 1980s. He goes after politicians, judges, police, the press. And this is something that is going to catch the United States' attention because it seems like Colombia might be on the verge of becoming a failed state. And Colombia had been a very staunch Cold War ally for the U.S. Throughout the latter half of the 20th century. I will say that a lot of these individuals that I write about are very politically oriented. Escobar is a little bit of an outlier. Yes, he was an alternate member of Colombia's Congress in the early 1980s. He did harbor, apparently, some thoughts about maybe running for president of Colombia someday. But this is really all cover to protect his business interests. So I don't see him as very political. However, in the 1980s, the CIA is going to develop a term, narco-terrorist, to try to combine this nexus of illegal narcotics with leftist insurgent groups that were springing up all over Latin America in the 1980s. So this puts these things together. The war on terror and the war on drugs kind of come together here. And this will also justify the United States sending trainers and hundreds of millions of dollars in aid money to Colombia over the 1980s and 1990s to try to go get Pablo Escobar. The last chapter that I have here is on Osama bin Laden. Again, for those of you who have taken the War on Terror class, hopefully a name you all remember. But bin Laden, somebody who gave up a life of wealth and privilege to try to wage holy war against the United States. And he becomes the most famous, or really infamous, terrorist in US history. He's the head of this network he calls Al-Qaeda, the base, which is responsible for financing or organizing attacks against the United States throughout the 1990s. It's going to culminate in 9/11. His point was to try to reform the Middle East into some sort of Islamist utopia. He wanted to get rid of the United States' secular and overbearing influence in the Middle East. And so this is where the clash is going to take place. And it's the American efforts to try to get him after 9/11 that's going to lead to the global war on terror, which to some extent is still going on to this day. So what I'd like to do last here is to close by reading a passage from the book's conclusion, after which I'd be happy to take Q&A from the audience, and also sign some books if anybody has any. But I wanted to read the tail end here, just to kind of give you a sense of what I cover here. So the men considered here violently confronted American empire to varying degrees. Some were more principled about it than others. Sandino, for example, was driven to preserve Nicaraguan independence, as demonstrated when he voluntarily laid down his arms after US forces left. Guevara, while fighting in Bolivia, refused to threaten or intimidate the locals that he was trying to recruit to his flailing insurgency. In contrast, Escobar's main aim was intensely personal, to preserve his illicit drug cartel and to avoid extradition. Bin Laden had no compunction, taking aims at thousands of civilians. Baghdadi and ISIS wantonly slaughtered anyone who did not cooperate with their mission. Nevertheless, Americans generally saw them all within a similar framework. It helps to explain why certain rhetoric has persisted over the years and has been effective in generating popular support for US policies, because it identifies distinctions between them and us. If these threats in opposition to the United States are seen as subhuman, barbaric, or evil, then by extension, it means that Americans must be humane, civilized, and good. This line of reasoning reinforces a sense of American exceptionalism, a concept whose roots can be traced to the Puritans of the 17th century, that Americans are somehow special and unique compared to those of all other nations. Moreover, such terminology has been useful in justifying the bending or breaking of established rules of military engagement. If laws of war are for the benefit of legitimate state-sanctioned combatants, then it stood to reason that illegitimate non-state actors, like bandits and terrorists, were not entitled to those protections. This rationale enabled the Bush administration to support torture and indefinite detention of prisoners during the global war on terror, but such precedents had long been established in prior pursuits and conflicts. Thank you very much, and now I'd be happy to take any questions.